everyone, it is Juice here. Welcome back to another video and yet another meta tier list. It's been a while since my last one, and before, Furina wasn't out yet, and the Fontaine meta was still new. But now, things have absolutely shaken up. Assumptions are C0 R1 for 5 stars, everyone is in their best teams, and only the ranked character has a 5-star weapon in their teams. So in Raiden Double Hydro, Furina and Yolan would be on 4-star weapons, but Raiden would have Engulfing. 4 stars are C6 with their best in slot R5 4-star weapons. This non-subjective tier list has been peer-reviewed by numerous credible and respectable theory crafters, so quality here is assured. As always, I encourage you guys to engage respectfully with my rankings down below in the comments. Let's get into it. First, we start with Aloy. She doesn't really do anything. She doesn't do damage, she can't take advantage of any reactions, and fits very weakly with Genshin supports. Very weak elemental application, and no constellations mean her peak potential is super low. She can generate a lot of particles with her skill, but since the cooldown is so long, you can't use it consistently. Worse due to having no justifiable reason for investing in her, unless you like Horizon Zero Dawn. Then we move on to Diona. She's got no use in the meta anymore. Her shield is fine, don't get me wrong, but that's it, it's just fine. We don't need shielders in the Furina meta, aside from Navia who can enjoy Zhongli and Furina. Also, her healing is quite slow, which doesn't work well with Furina's fanfare. This is also because she only heals 1 unit at a time. Charlotte replaced her in any of her previous teams, thanks to her far superior healing and much better use of Furina. Next, we move on to Candace. She doesn't really fit anywhere. Her kit is very strange as it's something that no unit was really asking for. Hydro Infusion is something all relevant Hydro characters can already do. She can give you a 1% damage bonus buff for every 1000 HP she has up to 40%, but Yolan eclipses this with her ramping damage buff, and Furina is obviously better with her huge damage buff. Candace also has ER problems. Niche use in Bloom by letting Yao Yao on-field Hydro normal attacks. And that's it. She can also let Nilou on-field Hydro-infuse normals. So that's something. She's best in slot nowhere though, which makes her a useless addition to the game. Now we move on to Kaveh. Aside from having horrible financial statuses, he's also a horrible unit, unfortunately. He makes Bloom worse. His Dendro application and kit literally slows down the reaction. Enemies can only take 2 instances of damage from a transformative reaction every 0.5 seconds. So Kaveh just slows this down and does not amplify or speed up Bloom as a reaction, as his kit would imply. Also, low damage numbers, so he's literally useless. Now for Xinyan. Xinyan only has Mono Pyro of C6 Bennett. Outside of that, bricked kit as she does no DPS at all. When built as one, it has no real versatility. A bucked shield, which isn't even that meaningful to the teams that you can put her in, as it will be pretty weak and split scaling, which makes it harder to build her into either role, and she has no meaningful contributions to Mono Pyro. There's no reason why you would choose Xinyan over the likes of Klee even, who can provide batterying to the whole team, for instance. And Linny's passive synergizes with Mono Pyro. Now we move on to Amber. Amber can only be used as an elegy holder in VV Vape. We have other comfier options for that. For example, Yanfei, and nobody plays VV Vape Tao. It's a difficult to use speedrunning team. And now for Ningguang. Now listen, Ningguang, as much as I love her, she's a Geo DPS who's simply fallen off. Her DPS is fine, don't get me wrong, you can clear with her, but the units we get nowadays just do more damage. The standards have went up. You can't really use Goro with her because she's an attack scaler and Goro is a def support, and she uses expensive support such as Bennett and Yolan to do mediocre damage. Her best use case is an R5 Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer holder in Navia teams, and she'll surface there or just in general if you want to use her. So now we move on to the second worst tier, Stale Soup. How can soup be stale? Well, let's have a look. So Chi-Chi can heal for Furina, and that's it. My personal tip for you to get more healing out of Chi-Chi, give her a highly refined sacrificial sword for consistent heals. She also generates no particles, which makes her a bad second slot in cryo teams, and most of her healing needs field time, so just generally not an ideal choice. So Barbara can heal Furina and also work in Nilou teams. An extremely rough choice for both roles. This is because Furina drains quite a lot of HP, and Barbara's skill has an extremely long cooldown, while Barbara heals quite little, unless you're playing her on field in a Nilou team. Nilou teams do so much self-damage in such a quick time that Barbara needs to be on field for that effectiveness. Also, her E range is just very small, very low Hydra application. It's not very good for proccing more blooms. Furina does low DPS and is tied to a bad reaction. Shatter does basically nothing and only supplements what is already a subpar kit. He uses expensive reports like Raiden and Yulan to get his job done, and they could be used for way better teams. On-fielding Raiden is a much wiser choice. You only play Furina if you like him, kit beyond saving. So Eula's backload and low physical output make her the worst limited 5-star pull in the game. Being physical also means that she's a lot harder to buff than most units. For example, she doesn't have access to Dendro, which is a really easy way out for a lot of units that were bad before. Physical is just really hard to work with buff-wise. Even innate elements such as Anemo and Geo offer far more valuable DPS options over Eula. When enemies run away or when they spawn too slightly apart, her burst can miss, which is an insane gameplay issue. She could also overkill tiny enemies, and then you have to stack up her whole burst rotation again. She's not intuitive to use and her DPS is too low to justify all the nonsense you have to put up with. Then we move on to Razor. So, Razor only has viability in Thundering Fury. There are way better teams to play with far better drivers. Raiden is the obvious answer if it's an Electro driver you want, or since you use units like Xiangling, Child International is miles more powerful. On-fielder Yai and Yai Aggravate is a far more effective use than Nahida. Xingqiu can easily be slotted into a cheap Hyperbloom team triggered by Kuki. Then just on-field Nahida for a ton more damage. Much more cheap Dendro options exist, but need less investment and deal more damage. As a physical DPS, Razor is just unviable, dealing even less damage than Eula. In Aggravate, his Electro application in Thundering Fury is the only thing that saves him there, otherwise play in any other Dendro team. Then we have Mona. Mona has no real use except for nuke showcases, as most characters don't have one big instance of damage that they can sustainably nuke, with her very short-lived Omen buff, except Ayaka. Kokomi is way better in Freeze though, and can hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and Tenacity of the Millelith easier than Mona can. Way easier. Mona's solo Hydro energy recharge demands force you to play Prototype Amber. Very low Hydro application, which makes her a bad driver and enabler for teams. She has a niche use as a C6 Furina vape team support to get huge Furina numbers, but that's on paper. In practice, you'll generally want to play, Furina, Bennett, Jean, Kazuha, or Furina, Bennett, Jean, Xianyun, something along those lines. It's actually quite hard to execute as well. Then we move on to Kaya. He does nothing but mid damage. Yes, at C6 he's workable, but those cons are hard to come by. He's only ever going to see play in 4-star reverse melt, which is something, and he's not really the most ideal cryo battery. Fine if you're a new player, but I wouldn't recommend him if you're already down the line and have other cryo units built. You know what I mean. So then we have Lisa. Lisa can hold Thrilling Tales in Eula teams and do some good work in Dendro teams. Other options with less ER issues and buffs that are higher quality are a lot better, such as Fischl, Kuki, and Raiden. But at least she's a workable free-to-play choice. Rarely she provides you with a defense shred when she bursts. Layla is an okay cryo shielder. We don't need shielders as much as we used to. Right now, of course, they're still fine, but they're not as needed. Especially not cryo shielders when Charlotte exists. We want healers. The Furina meta demands it. We have no use for any 4-star cryo sustain after Charlotte, as they are only a DPS loss. Rosaria can be used as the last slot of any cryo team lacking Shenhe. You either use with Shenhe or Rosaria. Units that offer offense on top of their supportive capabilities are far stronger. Layla only shields. Can at least hold Tenacity of a Millelith. Sayu is a Copium gene replacement and can do some niche multi-reaction swirls holding her skill. No grouping either! You're basically never going to use her unless you find her healing to be useful. Applying 4 VV does grant her minimal value, so if you need another animal, there you go. And then we move on to the whatever tier. Tolerable bread. Dory can only support Al-Haitham a bit. Outside of that, every other unit does her job better, such as applying Electro. That's something Fischl does tenfold. Her C6 also allows her to be an on-field Electro driver. We have Raiden and Yai Miko to take care of such roles with far more effect. And then for Yanfei, she's fine enough Pyro DPS, just outclassed. Pyro is a really competitive niche, and most options will outperform her by nature of her just being an old 4-star. At least she can run Furina in her focus teams, which is nice. Niche tank Fei builds will only work in Lenny teams or Tau VV8 teams. Ayato is very flexible, but is best in slot nowhere. Low DPS output indirectly competes with Nouvelle and Child. Unfair contest. His enabling does not matter in International, since Child's Riptides are unbelievably overpowered. Nuve also solos Ayato in every situation ever. There is nothing Ayato can do that Nuve or Child cannot. Even 4-star Hydro options like Xingqiu will have way better use in Ayato's teams over Ayato himself. Can work as a fully EM-built Bloom driver at least, but then you do 0 personal DPS with that. Will be a fine Bloom team. I would not say it's better than the Kokomi variant. Lynette has no proper use outside of aggravate comps. She can do some decent work there, but lacks good gripping. She's a mid 4-star, but at least she has a good design. You can put her on Favonius, maybe she'll do some battering for you. Toma can work in Burgeon and is sometimes used in Hu Chao team, especially at C6 where he provides some charge attack damage bonus. Fine for those roles, but one of his primary uses is Burgeon, which is a weak Dendro reaction. He's pretty cheap to build and use, and has nice utility since he can block self-damage from Burgeon cores, but you'll have an easier time playing other Dendro-based teams, such as Hyper Bloom. Hazel can be a comfortable choice over Sucrose in National. Give him 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, and he can drive the team, do a bit of personal DPS, but not much honestly. He can give AD team-wide EM as well, which is fixed no matter your build. No niche outside of this, and he's pretty easily replaceable, and at least Sucrose is grouping, he does. Chongyun is good in Reverse Smelt, and has literally no other purpose. Cryo Fusion is a niche gimmick if you're looking for a wacky time, but definitely not a meta time. High front load does mean he can nuke waves, which is nice, but Bennett will end his sustained damage dreams. Rosaria is a decent cryo unit. She does good melts, and all instances of her burst melt, and she is a fine battery in Ayaka teams. Melt as a reaction just isn't well supplemented right now for her to shine. Also, she's easily replaceable with Charlotte, but will provide some cool sub DPS. Kone has Dendro App, which lasts for a solid amount of time, being 9 seconds. For reaction, the actual applied element is also very strong, so you can cause a lot of reactions before her application burns out. The main drawback is how slow she applies it, and how little the range of her application is. And on top of that, she doesn't do any meaningful DPS. Yao Yao is a fine Dendro healer, quite good healing, but needing field time is an insane drawback. She has Baiju levels of Dendro application outside of her burst with just her skill. You don't want to take much field time away from your DPS units, so you can't get the huge amount of Dendro app her burst gives that consistently. Ito's fallen off as Navia has totally eclipsed his purpose. Her massive front load fallout class is Ito's middle of the road sustained DPS, which needs a ton of investment to get going. Noelle also far outclasses his value simply by the fact that she's able to use Furina as Ito cannot, as his best teams only feature shielders. Literally only his weapon has any value right now. The team is also bad for shield check abysses, so Albedo's pole worth has increased with Navi's release, but Goro is a fine replacement for him and so Zhongli. Being best in slot in Ito Geo isn't a big deal since Ito Geo has lost value. And Yoimiya is pretty much the same. She's just bad by process of elimination. Her damage is fine, but being single target locked is rough and other powers do more DPS than her and offer AoE. Nice ease of use over them though, so for some players they may enjoy using Yoimiya over Klee, who's higher on the list. And they may find their performance to be better with Yoimiya since she is so simple and device friendly, but from a more hardcore meta perspective, she's not too good for a limited 5-star. It's fine if you personally find yourself performing well with her though. Keqing's a nice quick swap unit in Aggravate, but it's mostly carried by Fischl Z4. She applies very fast Electro, and Aggravate is a reaction where you want to apply very fast Electro. That's what makes her good in aggro in the first place, and also what causes her to drive Fischl Z4 so hard. She's not good anywhere else. Remove Fischl for Kuki and suddenly you do Kamisato Art. 0 damage! Tainari is a good spread DPS, and also he's Greg Heffley, which is a major W, and he's fairly simple to use. But he's massively outclassed by Alhaitham. He does a lower DPS than him with much cheaper teammates. Still, Tainari is the best standard DPS unit, and not a bad pick in general. Beto has fallen off since Taser has fallen off. Hyper Bloom is better as it does its own reaction and allows for Electro Charge to happen on the side. There's a 2-in-1 deal, but Beto can't deal with Hyper Bloom as her burst doesn't hit the cores. We have a ton of AoE friendly teams nowadays, which are far better than Beto teams. For example, Bloom teams. Even so, Fischl is almost always more worth using over Beto, and her damage falls off in single target scenarios. We have a good few of those now. Dia has some use cases now. They're fairly new. Good mini Monopyro, a fine mitigator that allows you to activate his full Ascension passive, and she's fine in Ganyu Burn Melt. Also, she works in Furina teams. Obviously not the best choice for Burn Melt, but she's not as bad as she was on release. She has actual use cases now. Kirara's a fine enough Dendro shielder. She doesn't particularly do anything special, but can drive a team as an on-field Dendro applicator, which is pretty cool, and can serve as something to protect from Dendro's self-damaging nature. Nothing stands out about her. Alright Dendro application. Aside from that, mid-unit, cool cat ears. My beloved Ganyu. She's beautiful, but she's long since fallen off as a good cryo DPS. But she's still serviceable in both Ayaka freeze comps and mono cryo. At higher levels of investment, those teams are pretty good, and so is Ganyu in them. Not a bad burst cost too, so you can still run a damage weapon and enjoy Ganyu's burst sub DPS. And now we move on to the fine tier. These units are just they're fine. They're better than tolerable, but they're not exactly top tier or anything. They're just fine. So Sucrose is good on paper. In practice, she's extremely clunky and her C6 hardly ever works. You need a ton of elemental application for her to absorb anything. Her main value comes in the form of her huge EM share, which is nice in aggravate teams. Her gripping is also subpar, and her burst pushes enemies away. Being an EM sharing animal is literally the only reason why she's this high up on the list. Otherwise, Hazo does the same job. Risley has good teams which carry him completely. He needs his C1 first kit to be completed, and he doesn't do that much damage for DPS. Better to consider other drivers for your team such as Raiden, which can do what he does with less investment. His best teams involve Furina and Xiangling. That is something that Raiden can take care of just as well while decreasing ER issues. He does offer you the current best melt team to date, however, so there is that to consider. Sino can be a good quick bloom unit, just needs a lot of investment to get there. You have much cheaper options which can help you reach the same goal, and if it's a quick bloom team you want, Hyphen can serve you fine without any need for comms. He's a very expensive DPS to even start to manage playing him properly, such as Furina, as her buff up time is perfect with Sino, buys you for his buff up time and interruption res provision, and the heat up for insane Dendro application DPS. You also want the 5-star weapon on him. This tier list ranks based off of best teams. He may well be much lower if you can't afford him. Klee sucks to play, but if you can manage her, she can help Furina forward vape. She has a ton of pyro application, and she used to be the best in mono pyro before Linny came out. That's because of how much pyro batterying she's capable of dishing out. Xiangling and Bennett have no problems with burst up time when paired with Klee. Kazuha can also group up her bombs. Even so, you still have better options to use. Ayaka can do a lot of DPS and freeze, front-loaded too, but she's very expensive to get going. Very. Much cheaper options who can do just as well for a much more reasonable cost or the same level of investment would make them do much more than Ayaka. She needs, and I mean needs, Miss Splitter. It's a huge increase over Kageyuchi, huge. She needs Kokomi because Mona's Hydro application is way too inconsistent. Granted, Mona's good against bosses though. She needs Kazuha or Venti because Sucrose's gripping is awful with Ayaka and there's no use for the EM share there. If you want to unlock Mono Cryo or make Freeze better, then Shenhe is also a great pickup. Freeze has also fallen off a lot, and Mono Cryo is a team you only use when you're trying to force a strong Ayaka into typically unfavorable situations. Otherwise, it's way more efficient to just use another DPS. Noelle! She got buffed a lot. She's a team-wide Furina healer, and she's highly accessible. She can do a lot of solid DPS and works well with Navia too. Outclasses Ito as well since she can use Furina and he cannot. Not a bad unit. Main reason she's not higher is because she's locked as an on-fielder in Furina teams, and while she has a decent hyper carry ceiling, it's very expensive to reach and makes you gravitate to the Stone Thresher and building niche units like Goro or Yunjin. And now we move on to good tier. They're good, like shortbread. So Charlotte is an excellent Furina healer. That's her main value, and she's a good mitigator for cryo teams too. Jean is very comfy with Furina and great for building fanfare. A nice Viridescent Mineral Holder as well. Also nice in Animo DPS teams, is flexible and the highest value standard unit we have so far, great in Raiden Double Hydro, and while Sunfire is a less powerful but fun option, you can still experiment with it. But her main flaw is that she has anti-crowd control by pushing enemies away. That's not good. It makes her worse in AoE situations. Raiden is good. Flexible, great Hyperbloom enabler, and can drive the newest Double Hydro core. A strong Electro DPS. I personally think she's replaceable at C0, but is very comfy and has great ease of use. I especially recommend her for new players because she's good in so many teams, so any subsequent units you get will most likely work with Raiden. Really good if you're a new player. And for all my more experienced folks out there, Yai is very solid. Yai Aggravate is a top tier team which does not need Nihida to function. Baizio and Thirling Tales of Dragon Slayers can fare better here, in fact. Front-loaded AoE from Miko's Burst, and Fischl and Zifo's Kazuha can help her access this quickly. Yai's turrets allow for AoE sustained damage. She's great in multi-wave, and Yai's not a dedicated on-fielder, so her rotations are comfy. For having no Hydro in the team and no Nahida, Yai aggro clears pretty well. 4 gold in Troop Yai is also great for Hytham spread, just long field times which make her suboptimal for speedrun, but her actual clears are very comfy. Fischl is excellent in Aggravate, as the Electro application is so high, which lets her trigger a ton of A4s. There's a wonderful place in Dendro comps, thanks to her consistent Electro application overall. Yes, her A4 falls off with spread, but she can still support Yai in these teams when playing in a Hytham spread team. Outside of them, Fischl's just a very flexible unit in general, great in many teams and contributes solid single target sub DPS and energy particle gen. However, Dendro gives Fischl the best, most possible value, and outside of his teams, she will rarely ever be best in slot. Wanderer is a cool, normal attack DPS who does some solid quickfire animo numbers. Good DPS, but only with C6 Farazan. If you're a good player, you can use a subset DPS over Zhongli. Using Zhongli will lower your DPS quite a bit, since using Yelan can provide his team a lot more DPS from her own personal damage in the ramping buff. Furina also has excellent synergy with Wanderer, giving him damage bonus %. So his placement assumes you're of higher skill level, otherwise he may be lower. Also, he likes walking in the wild, because he's free. Kokovi is good, built on EM and Bloom teams, as she can proc plenty of high damaging Bloom cores. She also works in my favorite Furina team, Furina Mono Hydro. Great thanks to her team-wide healing, be able to provide lots of fanfare. Super comfy on-fielder, very nice comfort option in the teams where she works, and also a solid Hydro applicator in Freeze. Diluc is better than C0 Gomming, but worse than C6 Gomming. He's a very strong pyro DPS, so this is quite an impressive feat on Diluc's end. Nice for vape driving too, but it's his new plunge playstyle of Xianyun where he now shines best. Great that he finally got buffed. He's also able to play a competent melt team with Rosaria, and that's very unique because that kind of melt team is very rare and hard to find. So yeah, decent unit, great that he got buffed. Then we have Gom Ming, and this tier list to him the 4 stars at C6, so he's higher than Diluc. Goming does a lot of single target plunge damage. He's extremely high potential and utilizes Xianyun so well. He can also use Furina and consistently vapes because the thing is, when he's in the air, Furina's guys are still applying Hydro, right? So whenever he lands, he will vape every hit despite Furina's Hydro application being lower. And he's the best 4-star hypercarry we have in the game right now by a long shot. So if you're a new player and you're thinking of finding a 4-star to build for your DPS, I really recommend Goming. He's really intuitive. And then we have Hu Tao. So here's the thing, right? A C0R1, which is what this tier list is set as, can be very clunky to use. I personally have never had issues, but the majority of the player base does. She's good at driving the best double Hydro core. She's a strong pyro DPS in general. Nice front-loaded burst. Just super hard to play for many, and the effort is not worth it to some. C1 would have her put higher on the list. Now know that her N1JP playstyle, which means normal attack one time and then do a jump plunge with Xianyun, for those who don't know, that playstyle for her is stronger than Diluc and Goming's playstyles, so she will be the best pyro plunger, and that's why she's above them. But just be aware that she may be too hard for some people to use. Then we move on to Kuki. She provides healing for Furina and can work in some nice Hytham teams. Great Hyperbloom trigger, as you can build her on pure EM and she will heal any potential self-damage. Though Hyperbloom is not a self-damage team in the first place, but it's a nice perk anyway. And she'll work with Furina too. Just very cheap and intuitive, a very accessible 4-star unit. She's not locked behind Colton's at all either, even though this is a C6 tier list. So build her if you have her. Child, my goat. So, as you can see, he's back there, the grub. So Child International is a very good team if you can balance ER. He does 50% of the DPS in International. So if you think Xiangling does good damage, Child does good damage too. Hugely front-loaded nuke burst, and a fun, complex playstyle. Riptides are insane. Yes, he's locked to one team, but he's the king of national comp variants. Also, he's a very cool dude with bowls physics. Navi is flexible as a sub-DPS and can also dish out crazy damage in her own focus teams. She's super nice in multi-wave, and I highly recommend her. The best GO DPS as of now. She's less favorable in AoE, but does quite well, and the hardest Abyss Chambers are usually super tanky bosses. She has no good supports which work well with her, so Navia has huge potential to become broken if a unit that was released tapped in on her full potential. Zhongli's very flexible, super nice comfort choice, good with Navia, good in Ito teams, nice in traditional Hu Tao teams, good in Xiao teams, good in Scaramouche teams, etc. You get the idea. Works for Yola as well, 20% Rage Trade is great, lowest atom comfort, and damage to whatever team you're playing. Just avoid his burst if you can if it's not a Geo-focused team. He'll do decent damage if it's a Geo-focused team like Ito Geo. But the casting animation in most teams is too long, and you're gonna lose team-wide DPS because your other units can do more damage faster in the time it takes for him to cast his burst. just a special tech for those of you who didn't know. So Baizhu, before Shanyun's release, was the best healer in the game, and is still extremely competent and a good replacement for Nihida if you don't have her. Wonderful for Furina, fanfare for days, and he actually beats out Nihida in aggravate teams in single target scenarios, holding Failing Tales of Dragon Slayers in aggravate teams actually better than Nihida C0 in aggravate comps if you're single target, specifically single target. Aggravate doesn't want overly high Dendra application, swirling becomes too difficult then. So I recommend Baizhu for that team. His low Dendra application is more suited to the job. Great unit, super ugly, but I recommend anyway. The snake is cool too, I like Changcheng. We're gonna go on trail back to the niche supports now. We're gonna clear those, and then we're gonna head to the last 2 tiers. Mika is bad. He's literally worse than C6 Rosaria and Eula teams because he doesn't provide Eula with any meaningful buffing that comes close to Rosaria's C6 Red Shred. He fails as a niche support. His saving grace is being good in Furina teams, but as a niche support specifically, he fails. Granted, he is now best of Eula teams because he can act as a healer, and Eula can use Furina comfortably now, so that is something he does good now, but at the time when he came out, and he just wasn't so good, and even now, if you were just trying to play a traditional Eula team without Furina, he wouldn't be good. So as a niche support specifically, not as a Furina healer, not good. Yunjin is good for Yoimiya, but she's good because she frees up Bennett. Using Benny Boy technically still has Yoimiya deal higher numbers. C6 Yunjin can increase attack speed, which is another cool gimmick that works very nicely for Yoimiya. She's not going to work with Ayato if you want to play him in his best teams. Ayato does such low DPS, so there's no point in trying to buff him really. Not a lot of normal attack-based units to take advantage of right now, plus she needs a lot of investment in teams in terms of levels and towns to get going. Now for Kujo Sara. She's only really good for Raiden Hyper, but you can always just use Fischl here. Also, you'll only ever consider Sara if you're Raiden C2. However, Sara herself can actually do some solid nukes on a good build, so she can be considered if you're interested in making Sara a good sub DPS as well, and she'll work fine with C0 Raiden in that case. Goro is good, but being tied to Ito Geo is kind of meh. He can be used with Navia at least, with Elegy for the end for some attack buffs, but the defense percent buffs are useless on her. Decent particle generation, you can focus on ER and Def and be done with him. Very cheap to get going, so just use 4 Exile and stick Valve on him. Cool, then you're golden. So now for Chevreuse. She provides such high quality overload buffs, and she makes Raiden Hyper a much better team, but it's generally overload. Being tied to that reaction can kinda suck, because no Pyro unit really needs to run an overload team over a Vape comp, and Electro units are quite wasted in these teams where they could be used elsewhere. However, Venetia she works in, yes, she's usable and actually quite good, just no point in specifically running overload. But she will still be a good option. I still think that as a niche support, she does her job extremely well. She made overload relevant, which is very impressive on its own. Now for Best Girl Venti, my favorite! Okay, so he's amazing when he works, amazing. He isn't as niche as people say in my opinion, but he's niche enough to be ranked here I suppose. Can pull a ton of enemies, including nearly all Fontaine enemies, nearly all Sumeru enemies, can pull Heralds now, old Inazuman enemies have also been nerfed, he'll pull anything and anyone that is not a large robot. And shoot, he'll still lift large Sumeru robots, you know, like the ones in the desert, the little Dorito guys, mini ones. So yeah, he groups shadowy husks as well and they're cute. He doesn't pull them up, but he does group them. And Kazuha, yes, obviously Kazuha's better. Obviously Kazuha's better. But he's still so underrated as a second Animo choice. You can have 2 Animos, it's not forbidden to have Venti and Kazuha. Underrated, he does not need a buff like people would say, and he's the cutest character in the entirety of Genshin Impact. You could maybe argue Furina, then I'm okay, fine. But to me, cutest character, absolutely. Shenhe! She makes Ayaka way more relevant. If it wasn't for Shenhe, poor Ayaka. She opens up Mono Cryo and is also amazing for throwing a strong Ayaka into boss scenarios. And also make your freeze teams way more impactful thanks to your buffs, which have huge value in Cryo teams. She makes Cryo a more hard-hitting element, and if she did not exist, then characters like Ayaka would be much lower on the list. Horizon is insane because she made a next to irrelevant DPS like Xiao matter again. Matter a lot, in fact. It's quite good now. Also a big deal for Wanderer. She really does want that C6, otherwise she's nowhere near as defining as she is, but if his tier list considers C6 4 stars, then Horizon is ridiculously busted for Animo units. With Shanyun being out now, he's insane. And now we move on to the A tier guys. So Xingqiu. He's very flexible and he can work in any team where Hydro is demanded and has so much application that he can enable a ton of teams. His damage isn't so much anymore when compared to behemoths like Yolan and Furina, but his utilities are great and his Hydro application is very consistent. He's a nice battery for Yolan as well if played together. Do you recommend? Shang Ling does solid amounts of pyro DPS, great in international, Linny Monopyro, and Rio Melt primarily. Her main drawback is large ER issues. She's glued to Bennett because of this. Snapshots and can move around the battlefield. Great unit, but locked behind C4. If this tier list was not a C6 list, she will be a lot lower. I don't advise her for new players that don't have the C4 yet. Afterwards, go for it. Cheap and accessible in every other way. Her damage isn't as good as most limited 5-star characters, but it's being used alongside strong 5-stars, which make her good. Nilou of Bloom is one of the strongest AoE teams in the game. It's fine against bosses, just not best in slot. Unreal AoE makes up for it. So I wouldn't consider her nicheness too restrictive, like I wouldn't put her in a niche tier. Nilou also has a lot of partners within her teams, so I wouldn't consider her nicheness too restrictive. Like, she's nowhere near as niche as those in the niche tier, for example. Also, she's super cheap and easy to build, so no min-maxing required. Dump HP, then done. Not as bad in single target as people say, especially if you invest a little bit. So Linny simply does a lot of DPS, huge amount of pyro numbers. A great team, but is really reliant on his signature weapon. His tier list is C0R1, if it was C0R0, he would be lower. The strongest pyro carry on the market right now if you want a cool pyro DPS. Go for him. Xiao is quite expensive, but this tier list assumes best teams, best weapons, and in that case, Xiao is extremely strong. Xianyun was a huge buff to Xiao in recent times, and his teams have also improved a lot. Really powerful competitive DPS that works in both AoE with the introduction of Xianyun. Can't proc Yulan with his plunges. You can proc them if you weave 1 to 2 normal attacks in between plunges, but you're not making the most of Yulan's on sub DPS then. It still makes up for with his sheer DPS numbers. And you can also use Furina with him, who's an excellent teammate, especially with Xianyun being up, because Xianyun and Furina innately have really good synergy with each other, and then Xiao also enjoys that great synergy. And C6 Farazan made him a far more relevant DPS back whenever she released. Also, he's way hotter than Wanderer, so W. And he's just so crazy now. It's amazing to see how he's ascended to be like a top tier DPS now that all of his relevant buffs have come out, but I am warning everyone watching this video, okay? This is assuming best teams, best weapons. Xiao is a really bad free-to-play unit. Don't get him if you've just started the game, unless you love him, of course, which, like, fair. But you get the idea, okay? Okay, so for Xianyun, she came out recently. She's a great Furina healer, having the best specific synergy with her. She can apply 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, and is also a good user of Song of Days Past. She enables 2 extremely strong hyper-carry teams, such as Xiao and Gaming. She also buffed Diluc, who was below mid before, and also offered Hu Tao a good new playstyle for those who are playing her at C0. Enables all units to plunge in C6 Bennett Vape Plunge. Fantastic for any team that wants a healer, and can replace Jean pretty nicely. So if you like fun playstyles, she is amazing, but just as a unit, she's really good. I definitely think that she was a lot better than people were gonna think she would be. Okay, Alhaitham is nuts. His best team does huge DPS, second best carry in the game, easily. Super easy to use, but he has a really high skill ceiling, so to use him is like easy enough, but to, you know, master him, hard. Massive team-wide DPS, and you get a lot of Dendro application. 3 mirrors, better Dendro over Nihida. Super powerful best in slot team. Can run many different kinds of teams and can adapt his damage to many different situations. Also good in both AoE and single target. Good for him. Also, he's super hot. And now for the insane guys. Bennett still remains with insane flexibility to this day. Where he works very well, such as Internet or Lenny Monopyro teams, plus half of the released Fontaine cast still want Benny, like Lenny, Rio, Navia. Bennett is also very self-sufficient, where Xianyun and Alhaitham require other certain units to function well. Still an amazing choice, no excuses not to build them. Nihida, the little vegetable, has insanely good kit design, really powerful units. Dendro is busted. Nihida then proceeds to make Dendro go from bare minimum impossible to totally excellent. Her kit is a must for any Dendro team enjoyer, and it's a huge DPS increase to all of them, barring maybe Aggravate, where Baiju is better and more comfortable. I recommend Alhaitham Nihida and Nilou Nihida teams especially. Your socks will get absolutely rocked. Yulan's ramping A4 makes her a great buffer for on-fielders while also having ridiculous sub-DPS. Ridiculous sub-DPS. She simply does a lot of damage, has sufficient Hydra applications for most characters in the game. For signature weapon, she's unstoppable. Accounts of Yulan get a huge value boost, get her ASAP if you don't have her already. Nuve is the best carry in the game. C0R1 is already unbelievable. For those of you curious, if this is a C0R0 list, Nuve would still be in this tier. He is just that good. Simple to play, amazing sustained DPS, and solos the Abyss for breakfast. Utilizes Furina the best, and can use pretty much anyone, since Nuve has no set-in-stone teammates. He totally obliterates all content and has super low needs to clear Abyss in the recommended times. He's so high up there for such a reason. New and old players alike will fear their accounts to be transformed upon pulling him, Also, his English battle lines are unintentionally funny. Settle down! Kazuha is Kazuha. Enough said. Okay, bye, video over. No, I'm just kidding. He buffs damage percent, the highest value buff in the game, and he's a very decent Venerable holder as well. Super good gripping, solid plunge damage, and swirl damage. Accounts of Kazuha are the comfiest of them all. A must for those who want the strongest account possible. Sure, there's no must pulls, but this is my sincere recommendation to pull for Kazuha if you don't have him already. Furina somehow ended up being even better. My girl may or may not have C6'd her. The brokenest of broken units. The woman who changed the meta into healer impact like a true legend. Furina! She provides ridiculous damage bonus percent buffs. Better yet, she cooks a lot of sub DPS as well. Nearly as much as Yulan, if not even more in some circumstances. Forms a new best double Hydra core, the Yulan Furina core. Can make pretty much any DPS better as long as their team is a healer. Also made Mayo Hunter viable in every DPS as well. If Genshin has any must pull, it is Cutie Patootie Furina. She does have competition unlike Kazuha, but being used in Lenny, Navia, Rio, Shao, Nuve, everywhere. I'm gonna burn your house down teams. The meta definer. Furina. So, that was my 4.4 meta tier list. I highly encourage that if you disagreed with anything, please go down in the comments and let me know with reasoning. I'm always trying to improve my takes on the meta on this list. Please be respectful, naturally. And I hope you all have a good day then. Well, this has been Juice, signing out. And I wish you all a day full of Nutella, salmon, shortbread, and then eat your carbohydrates as well, because they're good for you.